This is Slowking from Neo Genesis. It is one of the most difficult cards to grade in the entire Wizards of the Coast library. Now, it took over a decade for Slowking to reach a population of 10, but yet in the last 2.5 years, that population has increased by 70%, going up to 17 copies in PSA 10. Is this population control? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. Last week I made a video addressing the population control argument, and this can be a controversial topic, and this video got a lot of views and even more comments from users that wanted to weigh in on this debate. Now, it's difficult to go through and have a discussion with every individual through text, so what I wanted to do in this video is make a follow-up addressing some of the common counter-arguments that I'm seeing and provide some data, some research, and some logic of my own. Now, I still welcome all of your comments and all of your counter-arguments in the comments of this video because I think it's a healthy discussion to have, that this doesn't have to be adversarial. It's not like there's massive implications on the line for being right, for being wrong. And truthfully, there's so many confounding variables that it's difficult to say anything with 100% certainty. Having said that, the first comment and the first theme that I noticed in some of the comments out there was that people were basing their arguments off their own personal experiences, their anecdotal evidence. And the problem with that is often anecdotal evidence is too limited in sample size and duration. In fact, this particular comment that I have highlighted on the screen acknowledges handling hundreds of cards and viewing thousands of others. And I know that might sound like a lot of cards, especially if it's coming from recent times, but when we compare that to the scale and magnitude of cards that PSA handles on a daily, monthly, or yearly basis, it is so small in comparison that it's hard to pull any definitive conclusions from that. In fact, GemRate recently released PSA's 2024 totals, and in 2024, PSA graded over 15 million cards. So we're comparing hundreds against millions, and that's just 1 year's worth of data. Now, one thing I think is also important here is that the idea of belief persistence, it's this psychological phenomenon where people react in almost a defensive way. It's a defense mechanism for self-preservation of rejecting contrary evidence. And that's exactly what I'm going to offer mostly in this video, is we're going to look at 27 of the most difficult to grade cards in the Wizards of the Coast era, vintage cards exclusively, and see exactly how those population reports have changed and whether or not they've stagnated in the last few years or if they are in fact still increasing. Now, before we get into some numbers, I wanted to cite my sources, and all of this population data is pulled from pokedata.io. It's a great website for tracking price history, as well as population changes over time. But anyway, taking a look at our first three cards, these are ones from Jungle Set, some of the most difficult cards to grade from that set. And the change in population for PSA 10s is actually pretty small, going from March of 2022 to December of 2024. We've got the Kangaskhan, which had 2 copies added to the population for 10s. That's about a 3% increase. The Snorlax had 4 copies added to PSA 10. That's 5.6% increase. Vaporeon, another card that's very difficult to grade with the light holofoil surface, added 3 copies over the last 2.5 years. And that's a 4.3% increase to the population report. Looking at Fossil Set, the 2 most difficult cards to grade, we've got Articuno, and this is where we start seeing the population reports increase at a slightly more expansive rate. But the Articuno went from 131 to 146, population increase of 15, and that's an 11.5% overall increase in Gem Mint 10s. The Lapras, most difficult card to grade from Fossil, went from 109 to 119 copies. That added 10 copies, or about 9%. Dark Magneton is a very low population card, very light holofoil surface, extremely difficult to grade even though it's not a particularly popular Pokemon. This one added 10 copies to the PSA 10 report, going from 55 to 65, and that's an 18% increase. The Rainbow Energy is another one that's very difficult to grade, especially given that large holofoil surface, giving more room, more surface area for potential damage and print lines. This one added 8 copies, or about 9%. Looking at Gym Heroes, the 3 cards that are typically regarded as the hard ones to grade, Blaine's Moltres, beautiful card. I absolutely love this one. This one went from 61 copies to 76 PSA 10s in just a little over the last 2 years. That's a 24.6% increase. Sabrina's Gengar, another beautiful card, one that's highly regarded by the community. This one went from 84 copies to 104. That's about a 24% increase. And lastly, we have Brock, one of the trainers. Very difficult one to grade. This one has 51 copies initially, and then by December of 2024, it bounced up 12 to 63 copies. Again, that's a 23.5% increase. So based on the data so far, I think it's safe to conclude that PSA isn't completely restricting PSA 10s, as some seem to suggest. However, we still have more data to go through. If we transition into Gym Challenge, we'll start with Giovanni's Persian. This one has had 20 copies added to the PSA 10 report in the last couple years, bumping it up 17.9%. Misty's Gold Duck is neck and neck for the most difficult card to grade from this set, and it went from 58 copies to 64. That's an increase of about 10%. We also have Erica's Venusaur. This one went from 91 to 104, or a 14.3% increase in the Gem Mint 10 population. Next, we'll transition into Neo Genesis, and this is where many of the most difficult cards in all of Wizards of the Coast to grade reside. The first one is for Alligator number 5. This one only had 18 PSA 10 copies in March of 22. Now it's at 22. Even though that's only an increase of 4, that still represents a 22% population increase. Heracross went from 17 to 25. That's a 47.1% increase. Next, we have Lugia. This is a bit of an outlier here, going from only 43 copies up to just 44. So only one additional copy added. Now, this is one of the more expensive cards out there in the vintage era, so that could support the argument of it having more scrutiny. But on the other hand, a lot of the Lugias out there are more valuable, and because of that, the population of mint cards may have been more readily exhausted. So not sure if we can fully conclude either way on that one just yet. Slowking is another card that rivals Lugia for price, or close to, in a PSA 10. And this card was extremely difficult to grade, one of the hardest out there, at only 10 PSA 10s by March of 22. In December of 2024, that had increased to 17 copies. That's a 70% increase overall. Next, we have Typhlosion 17, another extremely difficult to grade card. This one bounced up from 11 to 12, which is only one copy, but that is a 9% increase. You can take what you will there. It's so small that sometimes the numbers might not accurately reflect how big of a change or how small of a change that population was. The Metal Energy is another one that's really difficult to grade. Went from 17 copies to 19 copies, or an increase of about 11.8%. Finally, we'll turn our attention to some cards from Neo Discovery, Neo Revelation, and Neo Destiny. Now, Neo Discovery, we've got the Houndour, which went from 23 copies in PSA 10 to 27, or 17.4% increase. Houndoom is also pretty difficult to grade. This one went from 33 copies in PSA 10 to 41. That's a 24.2% increase. Then there's the Smeargle. Light hull foil pattern here, very susceptible to those print lines and surface scratches. 21 copies up to 24 copies, or a 14.3% increase. Finally, we have the Yanma, and this card has not seen a single extra copy added in PSA 10 over the last 2.5 years. So that one is a big 0 in terms of the percentage of increase. Ampharos from Neo Revelation is regarded as one of the most, if not the most difficult set card to grade from these early WotC sets. This one went from a population of 8 to 10. That's a 25% increase. Blissey, another card that blanked it, going from 11 copies to still just 11 copies in PSA 10. Mischievous is another one that's on the top most difficult cards to grade list. This one went from 15 copies to 22 copies, or a 46.7% increase. And then finally, we have Light Togetic from Neo Destiny, and this card went from 34 cards in a PSA 10 up to 40 copies, and that's a 17.6% increase. Now again, one of the things I want to emphasize is that these are some of the most difficult cards in all of Wizards of the Coast era of Pokemon to grade. So the population report increases here are actually much smaller than they are with many of the other set-related holos. Having said that, of the 27 cards that we just looked at, 9 of them, or 1/3, had a 0 to 10% population increase. 9 of them, or 1/3, had a 10 to 20% population increase, and 9 of them, again 1/3, had a 20 to 80% population increase. Keep in mind that this increase is over the course of the last 2.5 years, and when we consider that grading these cards was really mainstreamed by 2016, and there was an active contingent of people regularly grading cards even before that. I know a number of us were grading cards regularly as far back as 2010. So So you got to keep that in mind that there's probably more cards being submitted in the last 5 years, especially since 2020 and the pandemic boom. But even going beyond that, there was still a lot of cards being graded, especially after Pokemon Go initially came out. So I'm not sure what the healthy number is if we want to make this exactly linear, but what I can tell you is that out of the most difficult cards to grade in all of Wizards of the Coast, the average population increase for these 27 cards is 18.2% over about a 2.5-year span. So if that's population control, I'm just not convinced. I'm not sure the numbers reflect that. The second common thread that I noticed to the comments on my previous video is this underlying belief that PSA is intentionally undergrading cards, knowing that users would resubmit them, and thus ensuring additional profits for PSA, that they have a profit motive for withholding Gem Mint 10s. But I think this is flawed for a couple of reasons. If we take a look at PSA's fee schedule, most cards that are being submitted qualify for that $15 grading fee. So PSA has the option of undergrading a card in the hopes that it would be resubmitted once again at that $15 level. But alternatively, if they gave a card the rightful grade that it deserves, pretty much any of the cards on this list are going to be elevated to that $60 upcharge fee, or potentially beyond, because for an upcharge to the regular service, that makes it $75. And the express service, we're talking cards that are valued at over $2,500, which many of the cards on this list actually would be, then that would actually be an upcharge up to the $129 service. So it would actually take 4 consecutive resubmissions of the same card to equate to that same $60 upcharge if they just graded the card authentically the first time. Now, we also have to consider that PSA has more overhead and labor expenses if they're going to keep taking those cards in and regrading them. There's the fees for paying the graders, there's the processing, the shipping, also the materials for actually encapsulating the cards. Also, there's going to be additional communication and employee training to describe to individuals which cards to withhold 10s from versus which ones to just pass through. And that to me seems like a logistical nightmare. It would be so much easier and more financially beneficial to just grade the card accurately, give it the 10 it deserves, collect their extra $60 or potentially $115 without any additional work. This would also better reflect their terms of service because they already have a process there for upcharges. It's nothing new. It doesn't require any additional work on their part. I also think it's worth noting that the vast majority of cards that are sent into PSA, especially ones that earn a Mint 9, are not being cracked and resubmitted. For most people, they just accept the results of what they get, and there's a risk in doing so. You may damage the card, it's inconveniencing, you have to wait, you have to pay a second time with literally no guarantee that the result is going to be any different. So I'm not convinced that this is financially beneficial if PSA is looking at it from a maximize profit standpoint. Finally, I wanted to address a third common theme that I saw within the comments to the previous video, and I call this the us versus them argument. It seems like there's a number of comments that are made that are inherently divisive, looking for someone to blame for the state of the current collecting community. And that is natural human psychology, but it's not particularly productive or always grounded in reality. The first version of this that I see is people blaming the evil grading companies out there, saying that they have a conflict of interest, that there are people actively involved in the grading company that are trying to protect their own collections. The way I've seen it phrased is that the grading companies own the cards, and so they don't want to grade other Gem Mint 10s because it'll lower their own value. To me, this is illogical, though, because what does that even mean for the grading company to own the cards? Are we talking about the CEO? Are we talking about the shareholders? Are we talking about the individual graders? Just seems impractical and illogical given how many different people there are involved in the grading process. We're talking hundreds, perhaps thousands of employees. And I don't know, the logistics of that just seem too conspiratorial to be logical. There are others that have blamed the evil older collectors out there, like myself, who are coming at this with a view of protectionism and gatekeeping, trying to preserve the value of our own collections. I guess I can't talk definitively about every collector out there. What I can tell you is that I've personally been working on completing some of these sets for about 15 years, and I would love nothing more than to see more PSA 10s enter the population, especially for some of the cards that I still need that are just impossible to acquire. Now, I'll be fully transparent. I like seeing the value of my collection stay relatively stable. It really hasn't in the last few years. It's collapsed substantially since the pandemic highs, but that's not really my main priority, especially when they're not cards that I'm actively shopping and selling out there. They're part of my personal collection, so the change in value doesn't really affect me until they're actually liquidated. So take it for what it is. I can't say that's the same motive for everybody out there, but that's the way I approach it. Finally, there are others that blame the whole grading system, calling it a scam. And I can understand this point of view, but I think that's an oversimplification because ultimately it's a third-party opinion, so you are getting that level of outside authority, but it's not a substitute for anybody else's opinion, especially an established collector that knows what they're looking at, what they're talking about. Somebody else's opinion doesn't make it right or inerrant. There can still be misgrades out there, and there always will be. That's just the reality of grading. But I do think grading has a purpose. It does serve a role. It's not right for everybody, and there's nothing wrong with being a raw collector, a binder collector. That's the great thing about this community is you can enjoy it in any number of ways and still be equally valid. So if you don't like grading, don't do it. If you'd prefer to start a binder collection and appreciate your cards that way, more power to you. I fully respect that, and I think that's great. So just my opinion on these, I think it's unnecessary division here within the community to take these really extremist positions. Anyway, guys, I said what I had to say, and I've shared the data that I have to share, but ultimately, I turn the question over to you because I still want to hear your opinions on this data, or if there's other aspects of this discussion, this argument, that I perhaps haven't considered. Because that's the great thing about this community as well, is this doesn't have to be adversarial. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, to their perspectives, and I think those are valuable. We need to leave our echo chambers sometimes, our boxes, and explore what other people have to say, concede points when they're worth conceding, and not get locked in to that belief preservation, because that can blind us to the truth, and often the truth is more complex and nuanced than we might initially believe. Those are my thoughts, everybody. I welcome yours, but that's going to wrap it up for this one. I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. We'll see you with the next video. Till then, stay well, everybody. Don't forget to have fun. That's the whole point of this community and this hobby. We'll see y'all in the next video. Bye, everybody.